Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. I would greatly appreciate it. And also, feel free to leave a comment and or suggestion down below if there's anything you want to see in particular. So let's jump into it. A while back, I made a video, and I believe it's this one right here that I'm hovering over, that kind of explained how to set up your local development environment for Salesforce Lightning, and that kind of being like the Lightning Web Components and all the other stuff. But I've kind of realized more recently that perhaps more orgs might still be in the org-based model type of development, and that meaning that your source of truth and the code that you're creating, you create it first and foremost within the Salesforce environment, and maybe perhaps using like the regular dev console that's online. And I thought that it might be a good idea to create a video to show you how you could still keep that model instead of perhaps switching to like the repository type of model where now your source of truth is in like a Git or GitHub repository, and we'll still make use of like VS Code and all those cool tools that will help us with our development, but we'll continue to use the org-based model. So let's kind of jump into it and see how we can make use of these cool new tools and still continue using the same model that we might have in our org. So the first thing you're going to want to do, and just as an FYI, if you already saw this video of mine, a lot of the steps are going to be the same thing. And meaning by that you'll still want to download the Salesforce CLI, which is the command line interface. This basically gives you a lot of different commands that you can run. And I'll show you guys in a second about this pretty cool extension you can download for Visual Studio Code. So you don't actually have to memorize the SFDX commands because some of them might look a little weird, and who wants to memorize a bunch of commands when you can just kind of click a button, which is kind of the whole point of Salesforce to begin with. So anyways, go ahead and download the Salesforce CLI for your respective operating system. Once you have that, you'll want to, if you haven't already done so, you'll want to go ahead and download Visual Studio Code, which is our text editor that we'll be using. And once you have that, additionally, you'll want to go ahead and get the Java JDK. So you can just search for Java JDK, and you can either download it from oracle.com, or if you don't feel like making an account with them and signing up, you can get the AdoptOpenJDK. So if you just type in AdoptOpen, it should be the first link right here, and you'll see. And I believe at the time of me recording this video, AdoptOpenJDK was in the process, or it already happened, that they kind of rebranded, as you'll see here, that you can click on this link. It's called adoptium.net. If you click on it, it'll take you to this other looking site, and it's all the same thing. Just go ahead and download this one, Tamarin 11. And I believe if you go any further than 11, then some of the Salesforce CLI tools might not work for you. So kind of be aware of that. In my case, I just installed number 11 right here, and I was good to go. So once we have all of that, let's jump into our VS Code and kind of get that set up. Back in our Visual Studio Code, one of the first things we want to do is we want to click on this extensions button right here. When we do that, you'll see, well, at least in mine, I already have a lot of different plugins or extensions installed. But the one that's most important to get this going is one called Salesforce Extensions. And you'll see here, it should be the first one if you type this in. It's the extensions pack, which pretty much comes with like 9 other extensions. And what this is pretty much giving us is a couple of different extensions that will provide like linting, a linting for like Visualforce and Apex, and like a debugger. And as you can see here, if I scroll down, you can see all the different things it provides to us, as well as something that's very important. It's this extension right here called the Salesforce CLI integration. And essentially this will kind of give us a click and point way of executing those commands that we installed into our system a moment ago. And to kind of show that, well, first things, go make sure you install this extension pack. I've already done so I don't have to do it again. But essentially, once you've installed this extension pack, and once you also have the CLI tool installed, you should be able to, if you're on PC, on your keyboard, you can hit Control-Shift-P. And if you're on a Mac, you can hit Command-Shift-P, and that will open up the command palette. If you've done everything up until now that I've mentioned, you should be able to type in SFDX, and here you'll see a bunch of different commands. And I guess that kind of sums up how we can go ahead and set up. Now, I guess to kind of like tie this in nicely, I'll kind of show how we can go ahead and connect to an org. In this case, I'll probably use my Trailhead org, and then I'll kind of like walk us through how we can still use the org-based model, meaning that we're going to keep all our code and the source of truth within Salesforce, and we're not going to utilize any Git or GitHub repositories, but I'll create an Apex class within this here, and I'll also pull some information or an Apex class from our org, and then we'll make changes and we'll pretty much redeploy it back into the org. So let's go ahead and do that. To start with, still in the command palette, I'm going to go ahead and click on this command right here, create project with manifest. And I'll explain what that means in a second, but let's go ahead and click on it. And you'll see here that once we clicked on it, we have 3 more options: the standard template, empty, or analytics. Let's go ahead and use the standard template, and let's go ahead and give this a name. So I'll just call this demo SF for now. And then it's going to ask me where I want to store this in. I'll just kind of drop it in my desktop. That's fine. Once I've done that, you'll see here that we now have, well, a couple things. It looks like we have some errors right here. And well, the first one, that's because I've kind of already done this in the past. So it's complaining that it can't connect to my org, which is fine. I'll just kind of ignore that. The second one, and I kind of did this on purpose, is that I kind of removed the path to my Java definitions in VS Code. And that's pretty much what we have to do next. If we go to file or code, if you're on PC, I believe it's file. If you're on Mac, it's code. Go to preferences and then go to settings. And then we're going to type in Apex. And you should see here that we have basically an entry for Salesforce DX VS Code Apex Java home. Essentially, just kind of copy the contents of wherever that JDK you installed is at. So if you click on this little error message right here, we should get redirected to a web page. And let me go ahead and show you that. It's going to look something like this. It's pretty much explaining how to set up Java on either PC or Mac, depending on what you're using. So essentially, all it needs is for it to know where your Java JDK is at, so that whenever you're running any Apex, because I believe the Apex programming language is based on Java, it needs to know where that JDK is so it can basically execute the Apex for you. So I won't really go too much into detail, but essentially, if you're on Mac, your path might look something like this, and if you're on Windows, it might look something like this. So kind of find where it's at, either by browsing your contents on your computer or by running a command to figure out where it's at, and then just kind of pasting it into your VS Code. In my case, as you can see in a second, I've gone ahead and pasted it where mine is currently at. So once it's saved, it should no longer be a problem. Moving on, you can see that that command that we used, which was to basically create a project with a manifest, it went ahead and created a bunch of different files and folders for us. And very quickly, what we basically did by specifying that we wanted to create a project with a manifest is, you'll see here, here's a folder called the manifest. And inside of that, we have a package.xml file. This is a very useful file. Basically, we can use this to kind of pull either all the information from an org or some information. As an example, you'll see here inside of our types tag, we have 2 different tags. We have the members and the name. And you can kind of think of this like the name is like we're specifying what kind of file we're looking for. And the members is, right now it's currently a little star or an asterisk or whatever you want to call it. And this is basically specifying if we were to execute a command that I'll go over in a second, and that command was executed with this XML file looking the way it is, it would basically pull all the Apex classes, because the asterisk stands for all in this case. But if we were to basically remove that and we were to give it a name, like for example, let's say we have an Apex class in our org called test class, then if we ran that command, it would basically, at least for this right here, it would only pull an Apex class with this name. It would still go through all the other tags and basically download all the Apex pages that exist in your org. But that's kind of like an easy way of like pulling all the information or a subset of information from your org. I'll also show you guys another tool we can use to do that in a second. But what I'm referring to as the command you can run is, you can right click on your package.xml and you should see a command down here. You don't see it because I haven't connected yet. to an org. So let's go ahead and do that. To connect to an org, we're going to hit Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P to bring up the command palette. And we're going to run a command called, so make sure you type in sfdx to get a list of all your different commands. Basically, you want to run this one, authorize an org. So when we click on that, and I guess this is a good sense to specify as well, there is another file called the sfdx project.json. If we double click on that and open it, something that's kind of important is this key value pair right here. By default, this key value pair is set to login.salesforce.com. If you're doing any type of development, I'm thinking it probably would be like a sandbox environment. So maybe perhaps change this to test.salesforce.com, or even better, perhaps your my domain would probably be the best if you had that set up. But even if you don't do that, if we click on authorize an org, you still have the option to click into any of these as well. I only bring that up because it might be a good idea to put your my domain or change it to test.salesforce.com. That way there's no chance for you to make an error and accidentally connect to your production org and make some critical mistake. So in my case, I'm connecting to a Trailhead org, so I can just use the login.salesforce.com to connect to that. So I'm going to just choose project default, and here it's asking for an alias, and that's just a quick way, that's just a way for us to give a name to this connection that we can reference in the future. So I'll just say this is called Trailhead org. Just for now, I'll click enter and you'll see that the command is running, and you can't see it now, but there is a page that opened up, which I'll pull to view right now. This is basically asking us to log into the Salesforce org that we want to connect to our VS Code. So essentially just put your username and password and then click on login, and that'll create the connection to our local environment. So once you log in, it will basically just log in straight into your org. But if we switch over to our VS Code, you should see that, well, in the output that we have some success message right here. And basically it's saying it's successfully authorized to my org right here. So now some cool things kind of happened. You'll see here we now have some additional buttons we can click. If we click on this one right here, this is called the org browser. We can basically look at everything that is inside of the org we're currently connected to. So as an example, let's click on Apex classes right here, and you'll see these are all the different Apex classes that exist in this Trailhead org of mine. And if you've seen any of my previous videos, you might recognize these classes right here. So as an example, in one of my previous videos, I kind of showed how to create a batch and, you know, the uses of a batch class. And if we wanted to see it here in our local environment, all we kind of have to do is click on this little cloud icon, and what it's going to do is it's going to run another command called the retrieve source from org. So if you click on that right here, you'll see here that the command is running and looks like it finished relatively fast. And now if we want to see that class, what we have to do is let's go back to our Explorer, and we click into Force App folder, and then we click on classes, and you'll see here that we now have two different files. One is just a meta.xml file, and that's the meta file just kind of explains or provides some background information about what the Apex class is all about. But if we go to the .cls one, you can see here, this is the actual Apex class that exists in my Salesforce org. So kind of just quickly explaining that this is kind of how you can go about pulling Apex classes or any type of thing that you might want, like, you know, whether it be a Lightning Web Component or a Visualforce page. And I think if you're working with org-based development, there's a good chance that this could be very useful to you. Something that might be even more useful is another command that you can run. So as an example, let's say you received a requirement to implement that you have to implement, and it's going to require a Visualforce page and an Apex class. Well, instead of doing it in the normal developer console that doesn't have as many features or cool extensions that I'll kind of go over in a bit, you could just open a VS Code and start working on it. And the way you would do that is you can right click on classes right here, and we can run this command called create Apex class. So if we go ahead and do that, you'll see here in the command palette, or just at the top right here, it's asking us for a file name. So I'll go ahead and call this demo class for now. And I should probably capitalize demo. So let's go ahead and type enter. And then let's just choose the default directory. I'll just leave it at force app main default classes. Once that command runs, you'll see here that we now have a scaffold, or basically the template for our demo class. So in here, inside of the constructor, let's just let's just do a debug. So we'll just, my apologies. We'll just do a system.debug, and we'll just say, hello from demo class. And we can go ahead and save it. And do keep in mind that even though we've saved it, this class technically, well, not technically, it actually doesn't exist in our org yet. To get it into our org, what we have to do is we have to go ahead and right click on the class we want to deploy and run this command right here, deploy source to org. So let's go ahead and do that. When we do that, you'll see here that a command is running. And after a few seconds or so, it looks like in my case, it failed. So let's go ahead and look at why it's failing. And it looks like it's failing because it's saying that this is actually not a valid Apex identifier. And that's completely my fault. I've been doing a lot of JavaScript and Solidity development lately. In Apex, it is single quote, not double quote. So let's go ahead and fix that. And let's go ahead and run the command one more time. So I'm going to go ahead and do deploy source to org one more time. And you'll see here that now we're getting a success message. So now if we jump into our org and we go into setup, let's go ahead and search for Apex classes. I'll click on that. And let's look for our demo class. You'll see here that we have this demo class in our org, and it looks like it was just last modified, which basically means it was just created right now. So I'll go ahead and click into this here. And you'll see that it's a very simple class because we literally just created it. And as you can see here, it does indeed contain the code that we just wrote. So that's kind of like an easy way of instead of using the dev console that you might be used to, we can go ahead and use VS Code to create our project that might contain the Apex class and Visualforce code. And you can basically work on it in your local environment. And then once you're ready, you can deploy it up into your sandbox to then kind of go through the rest of your workflow. A couple more things before we kind of wrap this up. Back in our VS Code, let's go ahead and jump back into our supply quantity check batch class. And I guess an interesting thing about VS Code is, let's say as an example, we're in this class right here, and we don't really have to know much detail about this, but let's say we wanted to modify another field on the supply object. So what I would do is I would say supply and then dot, and then I would do dot whatever field we wanted to do. Well, by default, Visualforce doesn't have the references to your fields that exist on your org. And that can be kind of a problem because, by default in your dev console, you do have access to that. So you might already be used to that. Well, in order to pull the references of any objects or fields into VS Code, what you have to do is run a command. And to do so, again, do Command-Shift-P on Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows. And we're going to run the sfdx command called refresh s object definitions. When we click on this, we get a couple different options. We can choose to refresh the definitions for custom objects or standard objects. If it's your first time doing it, you should probably do all objects, and that will ensure that you now have all the different references, whether that be fields or objects within VS Code. And I've already run that command. So essentially, once you run the command, what you should now be able to do is, as an example, I know that there is a quantity field on the supply object. So if I type in Q, you'll see here that the autocomplete or the completion suggestions is offering me quantity as a field option that I can choose from. So, that kind of brings up our VS Code to parity with the dev console. One more thing to note though, and this is kind of like a caveat. Let's say you refreshed your S object definitions. So you now have all the different fields and objects that exist in your org. But let's say another administrator or developer created a brand new field. Well, you wouldn't have the most up-to-date definition at that point. And you would basically have to rerun the command again, refresh S object definitions to get the most up-to-date definition. One thing that can kind of mitigate that, or I guess a way to like kind of get around that little limitation, is if we go into code, preferences, settings. If we just type in enable-s object, you'll see here that there is an option called enable S object refresh on startup. And essentially what this would do, and for some reason by default, it's set to false, so it's not going to run. But if you check it, essentially what's going to happen every single time you open VS Code, that command that we ran earlier will basically just rerun automatically for us. So it's not, completely perfect, but let's say as an example, some developers or administrators in your org, they created more fields than what you currently had when you refreshed. well, all you would have to do is, restart your VS Code, and then this command would run, and you would then again have the most up-to-date references in your VS Code. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers it all. Like I said, this video is kind of like a bit of a rehash from the previous video I had made, but that was geared mostly towards Lightning Web Component development and like the more newer model of development that exists within Salesforce. This I found it very useful looking at the dev console all day, even though there are some very simple ways of like changing the colors on the dev console. Like I much more prefer to use VS Code because like I said earlier, if we kind of click into the extensions tab, you'll see here that I have so many different extensions installed, and this isn't even my main computer that I'm using. On my main computer, I have so many more extensions. Some that provide some very basic like JavaScript linting, or some that will provide like coloring of different brackets. That way, if you click on a bracket, or just by looking at the bracket color, you'll know which one belongs to which. Little things like that kind of make the development experience, in my opinion at least, much better. So yeah, if you're interested, feel free to kind of follow this tutorial and see for yourself if this is a development environment that you might enjoy more than the default developer console one. So I hope you guys found this tutorial useful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.